Welcome back to a brand new video. In this video, we're going to continue in our journey through the React ecosystem. And in today's video, we're going to learn about the use effect hook in React. So let's take a look at some of the information here in the Notion guide that I put together for you. And let's first take a look at what problem does the useContext hook solve. So what's the purpose of the useContext hook in React? So in the previous video, we created a to-dos app, and we created our to-dos state in the app component or our tab level component. And from there, we passed the state down through the to-do list component so that we can loop over or map over the to-do state data. You might say, well, that wasn't too difficult to follow. But you have to admit that passing down the update to do, that was a function that we had all the way at the app component. So passing down the update to do from the app component to the to-do list, then to the to-do item, then finally to the edit to do form, that was really messy. So that was what we call prop drilling, right? So the useContext hook was designed to fix this problem. So when you have some data that it needs to be passed down from one, let's say from your app component down 5 levels down, and you don't want to use prop drilling, you can use the useContext hook to solve that problem. So what is the useContext hook? The useContext hook in React is a built-in hook that allows you to access the data stored in a React context object. It provides a way for components to consume data or share state with other components in a more efficient and clean manner, especially when components are deeply nested in the component tree. It is commonly used for global state management or for passing data down the component tree without need for prop drilling. So basically, you can use the useContext hook to store some data, and we call this data a context. So a context is some type of data about something, about the user, about the to-dos, about anything else. So is going to allow us to create something we like to call a global state, because you create that in its own file, and then you can access that data at any level, any component in your React tree. Let's look at some diagrams here. This is the app, the to-dos app, basically that we work on the previous video. Even if you didn't work on that app, you can watch this video and continue learning because this is a completely different video. And here I'm going to show you anyways what we did. So in the previous video, we created a app component where we had some state all the way in the app component. So we had some other child components, right? This is your parent component. This is a child component. All of these are child components because they render inside of the app component. And each one of these, they were reading some data, like the to-dos. We were mapping over the to-dos here, the to-dos data, which it was a state of data. And then we pass it down to like a to-do item. Then other child components were reading like different functions and the state, because they were adding or deleting or filtering some of the to-do. So there we had to pass the data down through the prop system, and we pass it down nested to like 4 different levels when we pass it down in the to-do app component. If you want to watch that video, there's a link here to go there if you want to. But we're going to learn today how to use the useContext. So here the diagram changes a lot, because now you don't have to pass the data down through other components that maybe don't need the data. Let's say you have to this child component needs the data that you have in your app component in order to get it here. If this child is being rendered inside of this other component, you need to pass it down to this one, and then it will finally reach the component that needs the data. When you use the use context, you can create a context or global state data that can be accessed directly from any component level in your components tree. So let's say this child component needs the data here. You can just access that data directly in this child component, or if any other child component needs that data, they can also access the data from there. So with the use context, there's going to be no more prop drilling. All you have to do is access the data directly. And we're going to learn how to put all of that together. So in this guide, there's everything that I'm talking about right now is in here. And now we're going to start working and see how we can use this to fix this prop drilling and create some global state in our applications. So to get started, let me scroll up to the code sandbox starter link, and we'll open this one up in another tab right over here. And don't forget to fork this project here so we can get started. There we go. So now we can scroll back down to the example here that we're going to put together. All right, so let's start by going to the code sandbox here. And we're going to get started by creating a new folder. Inside of SRC, we're going to create a new folder here. We're going to call it context. This folder is going to contain all the different contexts that we're going to create in our applications. So in here, we're going to create our first file, which is going to be some user context.js. So we usually call it by the identity. So user context is going to hold some data about the user, for example. So now inside of the user context, we're going to import a hook called create context, and we're going to import that from React. So we need to use this hook to create the context object to initialize it, and then we're going to use the use context to consume the context data that we have. So in here, let's create a new variable called user context, and we're going to set that equals to create context. And in here, we can pass it a default value if you have one. And then if you don't have any data at the moment, any significant data at the moment, you can just pass in null for now. So we're gonna start with null. Right now we don't have any data about the user. We're just creating the context object. And let's make sure to export default user context so we can import it in any other file. So with this 3 lines of code, you have created a context object. Right now we don't have any initial data, but we're going to put that together in the next step. So now that we have created the context, we can go back to our app.js and we can import this new user context. So let's say import user context from that /context/user context. So after we import this, we need to wrap our application. So basically this here, we need to wrap it inside of the user context provider. So we can go right on top of the div here and we can say user context dot provider, and then we need a closing element here as well, user context dot provider. So user context dot provider is the way we are going to provide some data to this user context. So when you initialize it, you can pass in kind of like a fallback or default value, but when you wrap your app, there is a prop here that you can pass in some data. So there is a prop here called value, where we can pass in some information. Let's pass in some objects. Let's pass in a little object in here, hit enter. And let's set a name to your name. I'm gonna put my name. And then let's pass in a role, and let's set this to admin. Right, this is just some small information about a user. So now we have passed in some literal object with a name and a role to this user context. If we inspect the React DevTools here, and we click on this, on the context provider, which is this context provider here, you can see that you have a value with the name and role for the user. Cool. So we have set up and passed in some data to our user context. So now this user context is pretty much ready to be consumed, right? So what we're going to do, let's create a new folder inside SRC. New folder, let's call this one components. In components, let's create a new file. Let's call this one user profile.js. In user profile, we're going to consume the user context or the user data that we have in this context provider. So in here, let's create a basic functional component. Let's return. Let's wrap a div around. And let's set this to nh2 here. And let's say user profile. Let's export default user profile like so. So here we have our functional component. In here, we're going to import, if I can click here, let's import at the top, import useContext from React. And now we're ready to consume the data. We're ready to bring in the data. Oh, we also need to import the user context that we want to consume, because you can have different contexts, different data for different entities. So user context from /context/user context. And now that we have this two, we can go inside of the user profile at the top, and then we can initialize a new variable. Let's say const user ctx, or short for context, and set that equals to useContext. And we pass in the context that we want to use, which is user context. Whoops. Context. There we go. Now we put a console log here so we can see the user ctx or context. We can go, well, first we need to render this component, the user profile. So what we're going to do is that we're going to go back to app.js. We're going to import. Actually, I think we can just call it from after the h1. Let's just call the user profile. So it can be imported for us right on top here. Make sure you have this imported. If not, just do it manually. And now we have the hello context h1, and then we have the user profile component. You can see here the tree has changed. You have the app context provider, which is your user context provider, and then you have the user profile component, which is this one. So now that we have rendered this component, we have a console log here, which should be giving us the user context, which should be this data that we're passing in the value here. So let's head over to the console. In the console, let's give it a quick refresh here. See, there we go. Now we have this context or this data being logged from line 6 here in the user profile. So now we have access to the data. Now we can use this data to render some data into the UI. So let's destructure what we need. So we have a name and a row. So let's say const curly brackets name and row. Let's destructure that from user CTX or user context. So that way we can just have a cleaner JSX here. So in here, let's have a div so we can group together this information. Inside of the div, we're gonna have, let's just have another div, and then let's say name, and then displayed in the name here of the user, and close this div. There we go. We can see the name here, and the name, your name should be on here. And then we can also do the same for the row of the user, row like so. And that's it. Pretty much this is everything we need to do. Right now we created some user context, which create kind of like a global data around the application by wrapping our app. So anything inside of this here have access to this user context provider, which has the value of the object with the user data. And we can access this data on any component that we render inside of this application, even nested inside of the user profile or any other component. So pretty much this is everything you need to do to create and consume the data inside of the context. Now I want to give you another example. You can have many different contexts. You can have a context for the user, for the theme of the app, for to-dos, for any data that you have. So let's create another one so we can see something slightly different, because there is something here right now. If the initial data that you pass here, it works as a fallback or as a static data or default data to this use context. Right now we're not passing any, but I want to give you another quick example. Let's close this one and we can keep these two open. Let's create a new context here. Let's create a theme context so we can create some light and dark mode for the application. In here, let's do the same step. Let's import create context. Same step we did with the user. Let's create a variable called theme context. Set that equals to create context. And in here, let's say if we're creating a thing, which is let's say light mode or dark mode, let's say our initial value or our fallback value could be light for the light theme. So we can pass in the string light as the default value. Let's export default theme context here. All right, so now we have created a new context object, and it has the initial value of light. Now we are good to go here. We can go now back to the app component, and inside the app component, we can import this new context. We can say import theme context from /context /theme context. Right now we have two different ones, the user and the theme. Now, after the first opening user context provider here, we can wrap another one here. We can say theme context dot provider and wrap the closing one after the div theme context dot provider and close it right up here. I forgot the / here. There we go. Now if we look here, we have a user context and now we have a theme context here. This looks hard to read. You can create a separate variable and pass in the user information and then pass in the variable here, but I'm just gonna keep it like this because we're not gonna touch this anymore. So in here, if we look at the React DevTools, we have the app, we have the context provider, we have another context provider here. If we click on this one, we have some values, and this is the one for the user. If we click on this one, right now we don't see anything because this value, like I said, this value is kind of like a fallback value. Is something that is in case there's nothing else, it has some default value, and we're able to read it, but we don't need to use this right now because we need some type of data that is able to change with time, because we want to be able to change this theme to either light or dark. So in order to have some data that can change over time, we're going to create a new state variable. So in app component, let's import useState. Let's import that from React. Let's create a state variable here. We're gonna say const. Let's call this one theme and set theme equals to useState. And let's pass in the string light again here. Why are we doing this again? Is because we need some data that we can change over time. Because this, in the theme context, this is some static data. This is kind of like a fallback data, which we are not going to be updating right now. We need something that we can update, and our application could really see the changes. When this changes, we were using the state, our application could re-render and see the new changes inside of the application. So by creating this here, we're creating some state variable that we can update over time. And what we can do with these two values is that we can make these two available globally by passing it to the theme context provider. So here in the value prop here, we can pass in a object here. So we can say curly brackets theme, comma, that theme as well. And now that we have passed in this data here, if we click on this provider here now, there we go. On the second one, we have the theme, which is light right now, and then the theme function to update this variable when we need to. Perfect. So now we have set up two different contexts, one for the user, one for the theme of the application. Now we're going to go back to the user profile. We're going to do everything in the user profile here. So, but you can access any of these data again in any component that you create on your application. So in the user profile, let's import. We already have the use context here. If you are in a different component, you need to import this again. But here we already have it here. What we need to import is the theme context from /context/theme context. Now here we can have a second variable which is going to have the context for the theme. So here we can create right after this. I'm just going to group them right next to each other. Say const theme ctx equals use context, right? We call the use context again. Doesn't matter. You can call it multiple times and then pass in the theme context, which is the context that we want to use in here. Perfect. If you want to console log it, you can console log it. It will give you the same values that you saw in here, the theme and the set theme. So in here, let's just destructure those values here. Const curly brackets theme and set theme equals theme ctx. Cool. So now we're ready to use this context, the theme and the set theme function. So what we want to do here, let's first display the theme here that we have. So after the div, let's create a new div here. After the row here. Let's create a new div so we can display the current theme mode for the user, and then we can pass in theme. And we can see that right now is light, right? That's why we initialize it to in here, right? If we change that to dark, it will be dark. But we don't want to do that manually. We want to do that using our set theme, which is going to update our state variable, and that's going to cause a re-render to all the components that are reading from this state value. So in order to do this, let's create a little input at the bottom. So right after this here, let's just have a input of type checkbox, check box, like so. And in here, we want the default checked to be true if theme is equals to dark, because when right now is off, pretty much the dark mode is off. Right now we're in light, but when we click this, we want the dark mode to be turned on. So this is going to be checked whenever the theme is set to dark. So we just have this to put this in place, and in order to update the state, all we need to do here is to have the onChange event to listen. Let's listen for an onChange, and then we're going to call here whenever we have an onChange event in this input, we're going to call the set theme, and then we're going to check if theme is equals to light. So we're gonna put a ternary here. Is theme equals to light? If it's true, we want to return return dark. If it's not equals to light, and then should be light, so we return. Right, so we just checking, is the theme light right now? So if it's light, if we want to change it to dark. If it's dark, we want to change it to light. So we just have this ternary handle that for us here. So now this here, we're calling the set theme. So when we click on this, it changes to dark, right? And we unclick it, click it. So this is working. This is doing its job right now. And we did that by creating a state variable that can change over time, pass it to the theme context as the value for the provider. And then we just access this context in any component that you needed. And then you can just call or use consume this data in here and call this functions if you have to in any component at any level. So this is working. We pretty much are done with the context. And the only thing we need to do is to actually change our application to either light or dark mode. So we're just gonna do a quick classes here. So we can go over to style.css. We're going to create a light class here, which is just going to have the background color set to white, and then the text color is going to be black. Right, we're just gonna keep it simple, but if you have any more things to change, any colors that you want to use specifically, you just have to change it here, or if you're using any CSS framework, you can use those classes instead of creating your own classes. Here, let's put a dark class, and then this is gonna have the opposite. So we're gonna say background color, background color set to black, and then the color will be white. Right, so pretty much the opposite from the top. Cool, so now we have our dark and light classes. We can close that up. And now we just need to head over to the app component. We can even close we can keep that open to see it again. But in the app component, we have our style.css imported here. So we can access inside of line 19 here, this div here already has some classes from the Tailwind's CDM, but I just have that for just adding some basic styling here. You can remove that if you're not using it, but if you're using it, you can keep it. And still, let's just change these quotes to curly brackets, so we can use both in here. And then we're going to check in here if theme, right? We have access to theme here because we're inside of the context provider in here. So we're checking if theme is equals to light. If that's true, we want to return a class named light. Else, we want to return dark. And let's see, I'm missing curly backticks here. So backtick here and a backtick inside of this last one here will do the trick. So now this looks good. Let's see if now clicking here will change our application mode. So let's see, click here, and now we're in dark mode. It says dark. Then if we turn it back on, back off, it says light mode, dark mode, and there you go. So now you know all the basics about how the useContext hook works. In another video, in another app, we're going to learn a more advanced use case for the useContext. But for now, you know all the basics. You can use this to update any other applications that you have, like the To-Dos app. You can update it to use the useContext. And later on, like I said, we're gonna practice a new technique, which is gonna show you a little bit more advanced way of using the useContext. So that's it for this video. I hope you like it, and I'll see you in the next one.